So calling the Facilities Committee meeting of August 11th to order at 12 noon exactly. Let's do quick introductions. I'm Victoria Jetty, Facilities Chair.
Chip Malcolm, board member.
Dory Jacobite, board member.
Mary Cullinane, board member.
Peter Burrow, superintendent.
Brittany Gilman, business manager.
Dave Epstein, I'm with Truex Collins.
Great, thank you. How about a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Great. Second, all those in favor, we're doing all that?
Aye.
Aye.
Good. All right. Now is a moment for public comment. Just like during live meetings, this is a time for the public to have their voices heard. So if anybody wishes to say anything, if you could raise your hand electronically in Zoom, Peter Burrows will call on you. Anything, Peter?
Yeah,
Barbara, I just moved you over to talk.
You're muted though, Barbara.
There you go.
Awesome. Sorry about that. Good afternoon. I would like to make a few comments and observations after watching the retreat yesterday. I can understand the frustration that many of you expressed during yesterday's session, and I'd also like to offer up that many of us are feeling equally frustrated. Time after time, several folks have voiced concerns which appear to be dismissed as not meaningful or contrary to the directions that you want to head. Listening is more than letting people voice their concerns. Early on in my career, I had the opportunity to take a course that was taught by a Pace University professor that demonstrated what is referred to as active listening. One of the first steps is to actually acknowledge what you heard the other person say and actually repeat it back. It was explained that most of us are so focused on going on thinking about what they want to say next in defense of their position that they never really hear that other person's position. This was a key learning that helped me throughout my career, especially when dealing with customers that had issues, and we all have difficult customers, which you probably view us as. In our case, most often, if one of us says something, if it is responded to at all, the response tries to identify why the concern isn't valid. This has happened several times. This happened several times yesterday, related to things that I've documented in the past. Responses such as, of course we will make sure that we focus on equity and we won't increase social economic disparity. Just don't cut it with me. Words don't mean a thing unless you follow it up with how you plan to make sure this doesn't happen, which I haven't heard. What are the actions and steps that you have documented and are following to make sure this doesn't happen? High-level goals and words don't convince me or others that there is a plan. Or saying, don't worry, we haven't mapped students to schools yet, doesn't do it either. You've spent months on facilities. The building is only one leg of the stool. There are legs, the other legs are equally important. Does your 3 or 4 school model take into account the legs? I don't see how you can just focus on one. If so, how does it do this? Instead of dismissing our concerns, you would gain much more respect if you tackled them head on and actually demonstrated to us that you understand our issues and then come up with a solution that minimizes the issue. For goodness sakes, you can't even give us a concrete definition of what equality is. Also, instead of ignoring the fact that Shoreham has grown almost 40% over the past 5 years, acknowledge it and try to understand why this might be the case. Maybe we could learn something instead of dismissing it as a fluke. Give us concrete reasons why the school that is at 40% capacity or more shouldn't be open, and why it makes sense to disrupt the lives of 100 kids. By not tackling the issues that we bring up, you make us believe that you're not listening and not engaging with us. You may think you are, but the end result, by not tackling these issues, makes us feel that what we have to say is not being heard. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your comments. Anyone else?
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hi, this is Tanya Scuteri. I wanted to thank everyone for the work that you're putting into this, because I know it's hard and I know it's filled with complications. My first question is specific to the Truex Collins report and how we're moving forward based on the results, but we haven't really analyzed the study. One point I made at the meeting in March was that the study finds that Shoreham does not have the ability to expand, but we actually do have room to expand, both to the north and the south. And some people who have been around for a while know that the parking lot to the south actually had an entire building on it, the former Newton Academy. So there is plenty of room for expansion. And I know part of the decision-making process is we want to plan for the future, make sure we leave room for growth and surges. So I think to identify the school as not having room to expand when we do have room to expand is a really critical aspect that we need to address. And then I have a lot of additional information just based on my review of the study, but I don't know if we'll have an opportunity to have a Q&A with David, or how we can present those questions and get answers. If I should pose them now or wait until later or send an email, what's the best way to do that?
What do you think, Peter, in terms of your presentation going forward? Typically, these are sort of working meetings of the committee. What are your thoughts, Peter?
In terms of the
In
data?
terms of, yeah, in terms of providing time for Q&A with David, maybe if she submitted the questions by email, we could get them to David for written response, or?
Yeah, we could answer them here, probably.
Answer them here. So do you have, Tanya, do you have, what's that?
If she submitted them, Victoria, probably in question format, and then we could get them to David to give him an opportunity to get those responses together. And
Yep.
then we could either present them via Q&A, have David do an e-chat on it,
Yeah.
Oh,
or
yeah.
get it out in multiple formats.
Okay, that sounds good. Tanya, does that work for you? If you submit them to us, you can send them directly to me at my ACSD email.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much.
Yep. Any other public comment? All right, if we have a motion to approve the minutes of June 18th. I thought they looked good. Chip's motion. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right. Before we get into the bulk of the meeting with Peter and Brittany and David presenting information around the 3 and 4 school model, I just had some remarks that I wanted to make that I wrote down so that I wouldn't mumble my words and confuse my thoughts. So I thought I'd just read them, sort of set the, well, just some of my thoughts. And then we'll get into the bulk of the 3 and 4 school model. So Last night, the board had an in-person retreat to touch base, catch up, and discuss how we are all feeling about COVID, reentry plans, consolidation, equity, and our work around anti-racism. It was long, but truly engaging. The members of the board are concerned about the impact of COVID on their own families and all of the other families in this district. We worry about the students this district is charged with educating and caring for. We worry about their teachers. We worry about their parents and their parents' livelihoods. We worry about surviving this storm as a whole community, and we appreciate the strength we see in our leadership, our teachers, our parents, and our students. As Bill McKibben so eloquently wrote about last week in the New Yorker, we are lucky to live in Vermont. We know our neighbors and have a tradition of looking out for one another. There has been talk of halting the facilities master plan due to the pandemic, which we initially did to give us all time to get our wits about us and our feet under us again. No one knows when this pandemic will end. I would not dare to try to predict. What we do know is that there is a new normal, and it would behoove us to figure out how to plod through it rather than be paralyzed by the change and challenges that it presents. Knowing and understanding the communities that make up the ACSD in this is the never-ending work of the board and its administrators. As a consolidated district, this work started in earnest 5 years ago with the strategic plan, when community members from across the district came together to create a vision. This vision led us to IB. As our school communities grappled and embraced this transition, we were delighted to see our teachers and school communities find strength in collaboration. We heard from principals, teachers, students, and parents about the highs and lows of charting this new path. We attend gatherings, school events, student presentations, and days of learning. We receive news, advice, and input from community members all the time. We read comprehensive monthly updates from each principal about what is going on in each school, their victories, their challenges, and their day-to-day. The IB transition pushed us to look at 6th grade and embark on a grade configuration study, which included a listening tour, 2 surveys, and 3 regional forums. To move 6th grade was decided and postponed so that we could assess all the buildings and pursue long-term planning to direct and guide the use of district resources over the next 10 years. We wanted to be in a situation where we could proactively plan for long-term solutions as opposed to planning short-term and reactively. At that time, our realities of declining enrollment, increasing cost per pupil, and the financial implications on our community of spending more than we had did not support continuing the status quo. While Bruce McIntyre and our hired experts looked at every radiator, light switch, furnace, and square foot of our buildings, we continued our work in the community, hosting community dialogues, collecting survey and email data, sitting with community members, and listening to all voices. Individually, we on the board know a lot about ACSD community, its values, its hopes, and its challenges. As a group, we understand even more, and combined with our administrators, principals, and teachers, we know a heck of a lot. Back to today, and should we halt the conversation and modeling necessary to produce a plan so that this district together can emerge from the chaos of COVID with a direction to go to ensure a more equitable academic, social, athletic, and co-curricular school experience for all kids. A plan that would address our need for financial responsibility, meet the growing social emotional needs of our students, a high quality education for all, and begin to address our achievement gap, as well as decreasing enrollment. I believe that we would be shirking our responsibility as a board if we allow the pandemic to paralyze us. Is it going to be easy? No. But as we discussed last night, the board is unanimous in its desire to keep going. We believe that the financial condition of the state is going to result in substantial cuts to school budgets, and to not be prepared to mitigate some of the harm those cuts will cause would be irresponsible. What we ask of our community is to join us in envisioning community schools in a new way, with children attending from parts of this district beyond town lines. We envision the smaller schools with 1 classroom per grade that would allow teachers and principals the flexibility to merge grades or not, depending on student need, not numbers. We imagine community schools where the nurse, librarian, art teacher, speech pathologist, and reading specialist is there every day, meeting the needs of all kids and participating daily as members of the school community. We envision community schools where kids sit in classrooms next to other kids with varied life experiences. We envision community schools that create community beyond town lines. We know it's a change, a different mindset, and will be a bigger lift for some more than others. But we feel that it is necessary, and we promise to do our best to keep the public informed and engage with those willing as we plan for the school communities of ACSD. The engagement going forward in this new norm is going to look different than it has in the past, but will be just as valuable. Some ways in which we have already re-envisioned communicating with the public and that we are getting going are e-chats. These will be short interviews of key players in the district about district work on the facilities master plan, communications, equity, and any other topic we feel the public would benefit from knowing more about. We are also getting the sign up ready to start what we have named Porch Conversations. These outside in-person events will be hosted by community members in each town to provide a way for Mary and I to come together with people and answer questions. Our communications committee is spending a lot of time trying to make the website more user-friendly. There has been considerable frustration from both the board and the public as we make adjustments and find ways to be consistent with presenting information via the website. This is a priority, and hopefully we will see some changes that make ease of access better. We are open to ideas and know that though our interactions may be different in nature, we can surmount the obstacles and make progress on the work before us. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Peter and David and Brittany.
I don't have
Thank you.
anything.
Thank you, Victoria. That was good, and it really set the stage for where we are right now. Thank you very much for composing that.
Thank you.
I don't have an equally moving pay
Well, they're
in
not moving that way.
as you do, but I will here and talk about the work that we're doing and have done to prepare for this meeting. So in our last facilities meeting, the board asked for the administration, which is really me and Brittany, with some support from David, to look at the 3-school model and the 4-school model. Again, kind of like going back in time, annual meeting, we heard from David, who presented a number of different models, a 1-school model, a 2-school model, and a 3-school model. And we decided to add a 4-school model just in terms of looking at what that adds and what that gives in terms of space and flexibility, et cetera. So when the board made the decision, whenever that was, maybe 6 weeks ago, to kickstart the process again, and to, given the kind of financial limitations that we're going to be facing, and the challenge of going out for a bond in the near term, that looking at the 3-school and 4-school versus the 1 and 2 made more sense. So we have been working to put together a model, and that model is looking at what would the staffing construct look like, what would the kind of thinking about facilities and what the facilities needs would be, and David will talk about that after Brittany shares some of the staffing information. We also, we had our retreat last week with our administrators, and so we brought this question to our elementary principals to ask them in thinking about their lived realities and what they would envision if they were thinking about a 3-school or 4-school model. So that meeting, which was a full afternoon, was really helpful in getting their perspective on where would they weight the staffing, where would they, what would some of the benefits be of different kinds of positions. And it was not a conversation that simply said, let's just kind of take what we have and kind of mimic it in these other schools, but it was kind of thinking about some of the challenges they face currently. Some of those challenges are a result of scale. There are, when you're sharing a staff member across 4 schools, it gets pretty challenging for both that staff member and for those 4 principals to be working together to have a cohesive approach. So they talked about kind of some scale issues, thinking about full-time positions versus half-time positions, and a myriad of other considerations. Brittany put that from after that meeting, Brittany created a chart she's going to share, and I think that's a good place to hand it off to her, to allow her to share that information, and then kind of go into some of the specifics and answer questions as we take a look at it.
Okay, so I'm going to leave my video off. I've been having some trouble with my internet. So I'm hoping if I leave my video off that I won't get kicked out quite as often. But I will share my screen. Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah,
Yep.
okay. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, everyone can see that?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as Peter said, we met with principals and leadership to go over these models and to build the staffing out. So this is a sort of a theoretical model of the way a 3-school model could look. Obviously, we know that in real life, enrollments are never these pretty round numbers, but for sake of modeling, this is what we did. So this model assumes Mary Hogan, Salisbury, and Bridport are the 3 schools which we've discussed in the past. And at Mary Hogan, it assumes kindergarten section sizes of 5 and 2 at Salisbury and Bridport. And then all other grades would be 4 at Mary Hogan and 1 at Salisbury and Bridport. So this brings the total enrollment at K5 to 720. It also does leave the ability, so it keeps the kindergarten classes small. That's something that principals emphasized that they believed was helpful. It does give us the ability to move that additional section around, though, in cases of a bubble. So if you had a relatively small kindergarten incoming class, you could move that teacher to another grade that maybe had a larger section size or more needs there. So you can see that this has 2 schools of similar size, the same size, Salisbury and Bridport at 120 each, and Mary Hogan at 480. So this is actually really similar to the size of Mary Hogan now, except that now Mary Hogan includes pre-K through 6. And one thing that I realized as I was modeling this is that we're really comparing 2 models that don't yet exist. So we're comparing the 3 or 4 school model to a K5 school, which we don't have yet. So we're comparing it to after the 6th grade move. So something important to know as you're looking at this is you really can't just go to the budget and compare it to what's in the budget or even current staffing, because that will change after the 6th grade move. So in order to compare apples to apples, we had to change the modeling, our current modeling, I guess, and you'll see when we get to that. In terms of sizes of the school here, Salisbury, I think last year or the year before was at 108. So Salisbury has been close to that size in the past. It is an expansion in terms of numbers at Bridport compared to what it is now, but as I understand it, enrollment has been higher in the past. So that's what enrollment in a 3-school model could look like. Basically in Salisbury and Bridport, there are 7 total sections because there are 2 sections of 1 grade. I'm scrolling down now. So this is the staffing model that we built with principals. And I'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to the end. But one thing, when we asked principals to model this, we said, tell us, what the priorities would be for a 1.0 FTE for lack of better term, electives. So non-classroom positions like guidance, librarian, nurse. I'll refer to those as electives just for ease. But what came out of that conversation was that there was a general consensus that the enrollment at Salisbury and Bridport in the model didn't actually warrant full-time FTE for many of these positions. I do have the information when we get closer to the end to talk about what that would mean cost-wise if we wanted to bring all those positions to a 1.0 FTE. But this is the model that was built. So some things are easy to figure out, like classroom teachers. It's the number of sections. Some other things that we've taken into consideration here are work that's being done at the design team, which Vicki presented to the board a couple of months ago, I think. So talking about how we deliver services to students, so that's taken into account here. There's also some things here like interventionists, for example. Right now, some of our schools have interventionists and some don't, and some of them are grant funded and some aren't. So this model includes things like interventionists. There was also a lot of discussion about social emotional learning. And one of the things that the principals thought would be really valuable under the guidance section would be a licensed social worker. So that's included in these figures as at least a portion of a licensed social worker. And then here, all of these positions are 0.5. So that we set the minimum just for purposes of this model at a 0.5 for an FTE. Right now, many of our schools have lower than that, and it gets tricky to make a full person, I guess, to hire a full one person when you start to get below that. And for Mary Hogan, it's quite similar to what it is now, because again, the structure, the enrollment in the school is quite similar. So then we move down to the 4-school model, and you can see that we've just designated the 4th school as School 4. We talked about that we hadn't identified what that school would be. So this takes a little bit of enrollment from Mary Hogan and a little bit from the other 2 schools and puts it in a 4th school. It moves down. So at Mary Hogan, everything would be 4 sections, and then it'd be 1 section each at the other schools. So there isn't the enrollment to probably justify more sections. One thing that the principals identified that was important was that they believed that the 4th school should have the capacity to have single grades rather than blended grades. So initially when we talked about it, we modeled this school with some blended grades of School 4, but that didn't read as equitable. So principals asked that we model it with 3 schools of a similar size. And then taking the staffing model down here, you can see it reduces the classroom teachers by 1 each in Salisbury, Bridport, and School 4. Mary Hogan staffing remains quite similar, again, because it does reduce the enrollment. One thing that we found with some of these positions is that it's not necessarily scalable. So you don't, some positions are difficult to cut a full FTE or even a portion of an FTE just because enrollment has decreased slightly or increased slightly. So again, we set the minimum here at 0.5, even though enrollment was a little smaller at Salisbury, Bridport, and School 4, especially when you're splitting among 3 schools, it's really tricky when you're trying to split them evenly 3 ways. So right now, many of the schools have 0.3, 0.4, but we've already talked about those challenges.
Hey, Brittany.
Yes.
This is Mary.
Hi.
Hi, how are you? As we kind of move forward with this type of work, which I think is outstanding, it would be great that we can get the content that shows what the current state in the elementary schools are if you don't have, for like 0.5 and et cetera. Wonderful. Thank you. Look at you. You go,
I know.
girl.
Almost like I knew what I'd be asked. So
Mary's a plant.
yeah, right. I planted her to make me look competent. So I'm showing you the enrollment for K-5. This was a point in time in FY20 in September is when we take this sort of snapshot that we share in the annual report. So I'm showing K through 5 here, so you can see we have a number of classes with number of grades with less than 10, for example. Our sort of average cohort size is now more like 115 to 120. In the high school, we've seen sort of the exit of the last large cohorts of 150 or even larger in some cases. I should also say that I think that Erica was able to get this up on the FMP website, so this is accessible to look at. And then this is a big chart. This is a lot to look at. So this will be a time when you might want to go back. So I've modeled this again.
Sorry, Brittany, sorry, Brittany, to interrupt. And the website, so the board website has been simplified pretty significantly, and you'll see when you just go on school board, under the drop down, you can click facilities master plan.
Great. So I had to peel back some of the layers of 6th grade here. So I excluded 6th grade classroom teachers and also pre-K teachers and paraeducators, and I prorated them if there were blended grades. But I didn't exclude portions of other positions as a result of the 6th grade move. So I didn't, for example, reduce a tiny portion of art or a tiny portion of music. So I really just tried to take away the things that were clearly designated toward 6th grade. So you can see, highlighting down here, there's a 0.1 for music, there's 0.2, 0.3, a lot of, less than 0.4 positions. And then over here, I just tried to know with a G if this was partially or fully grant funded. And I didn't include the grant funded pieces when doing cost comparisons, again, just to try to compare apples to apples. Another thing to note is that there's a few blank spaces. It doesn't necessarily mean that services weren't provided. It just means that there wasn't a position that was specifically assigned to that school in terms of the way we do accounting. So it could also be that a purchase service, like for example, for speech language, we sometimes use a purchase service to cover when we're not able to do it with staffing. So it doesn't mean that services weren't provided. It just means that it was either sort of a district-wide position that was doing a small portion of their day there, or it was an outside service perhaps. So that's a lot to look at. I don't want to rush through, but we can go back and look at things. So here are the key takeaways. So the 3-school model as shown would save about $3.3 million in the first year of operations. And the way that I calculated that was really using averages. So I went through and I looked at what is an average teacher salary, what's an average support staff salary. I modeled it assuming that someone gets a 2-person health plan, that's kind of a middle road. So not looking at, specific people, we're just taking some average costs. And then assuming that personnel costs escalate at 4% a year, that would cumulatively save $41.5 million in 10 years. So obviously you only save it one time. It's not $3 million that you save each year, but when you look at the way that costs escalate over time, that's money that you wouldn't have to spend in the 3-school model. So we already talked about how in the leadership meeting, there was consensus that enrollment in 2 of the 3 schools probably doesn't warrant a 1.0 FTE for electives. And to bring all electives to a 1.0 FTE would be about $600,000. And then the 4-school model as shown costs about $660,000 more for staffing than a 3-school model. Other costs such as facilities, which David will talk about, aren't included in the estimate, that those deferred maintenance costs would increase the cost of the model substantially. And then as we discussed, ACSD principals felt that a 4-school model that had the ability to house single grade classrooms rather than blended classrooms was important if we were going to go with a 4-school model, because it provides, greater equity. And then also the principals, there was really a consensus that the 3-school model was preferable because it provides the greatest opportunity for equity. And it became clear when we examined it that the 4-school model wasn't really necessary given the space available in the schools in the 3-school model. And the last thing I wanted to add on it is about transportation. I know that we have talked about that, and the audit that we participated in indicated that in a 3-school model, we'd likely have to add 1 to 2 buses to keep ride times down an hour or less. And under our current contract cost, that's about $90,000. Right now, it's about $45,000 for each bus.
Brittany,
So
quick
that-
question.
Yeah.
On where you say the estimated costs in the 4-school model to bring everybody up to 1.0 would be 600,000. Did you look at what that would be over the 10 years? Is there a way?
But yeah, I didn't model that. I can model that pretty easily. So that was in the 3-school model. And that was if you wanted to bring all electives to a 1.0 FTE, it would cost about $600,000 on average. You don't have to do all of them, of course. We could prioritize. Yeah, but I could give you I could run that out for you.
Okay.
And Brittany, just to clarify on the transportation, this model is conducted in a way in which we're making a statement that the maximum amount of time a child would have to be on a bus is 1 hour, correct?
Yes, that's how, that was what the transportation consultant was modeling. Yeah.
Okay, and is that currently true?
No, we have some students that exceed an hour, but not by much. The average time is, I think, 50 minutes or.
But we do have kids who are on the bus right now go more than an hour. And in this plan, the directive to those folks was to do this in a way in which no kids on for more than an hour.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
So we're trying to make routes more efficient.
Okay, great, thanks.
I don't know, Peter, do you want to have David talk and then that might spur more questions from people or?
Well, yeah, I was just wondering if board members have any other questions on any of the data here.
When you look at the savings that the 3-school model equates to of the 3.3 million, how do we compare that to what some estimates are with regards to potential cuts that we're going to be asked to make over the next few years?
Yeah, so I should say that I wasn't clear that the 3.3 million is in personnel. So that doesn't include facilities costs, which David will talk about. But, nationally, we're seeing schools being asked to cut 10 or 15 or more percent. A 10% cut in our budget is about $4 million. Of course, that's cumulative. It includes non-general fund costs, but this would probably come close to or cover that if we were asked to make a 10% cut.
And Peter B., based upon what you're like, how should we be thinking about the range right now of those potential cuts, just so folks can understand kind of what that range could potentially look like?
I think the only metric we have right now, because we haven't gotten anything from Vermont other than focusing on the current fiscal year, and we've been told that we're going to get some information, I think early September, from the House Ways and Means and kind of from Finance in terms of starting to shape some of those costs. So right now we're looking nationally at the impact, and there does seem to be across all states, there seems to be Brittany mentioned 10 or 15. I would say, as I've looked at what other states are discussing in looking forward, and I think they have entirely different ed funding systems than we do, and they operate differently, and many of them don't have the same kind of runway to approving a budget that we do. So they can, and they did in a lot of states come out and say, we're reducing budgets. This was in June, saying we're going to reduce budgets by 10% for September. That's not how we operate, obviously. So I would say that number, that the 10% number, if I had to, just using what I know from nationally, I would say that I don't see any indications in Vermont of anything happening significantly to make us different from other places.
Okay. Thank you.
But again, it's like everything else during the pandemic. It's a total unknown as well. So,
we are
doing our best.
Right, but we are confident though that what we're not seeing is any indication whatsoever that we're okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Is that a safe statement?
Yeah. There's a lot of fear.
And well, beyond just fear, I mean, there's also a lot of data that's pointing towards reduced revenue.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm just saying, I'm saying fear because we're not looking at the Vermont data yet.
Yeah.
But we expect it to be fairly significant. I mean, that's what Peter Conlon shared last night. And he's on, the House Ed Committee, so he's in the middle of a lot of these conversations. And everything I've heard from folks at the state level is pointing to a significant drop in revenue.
And remind me, I think Peter spoke about, I mean, there are plans, when session gets going, to do the modeling for, I forget what he said about sort of timeline around estimates as to what the next fiscal year will look like in terms of revenue and the impact on the ed fund. Do you remember?
I don't think
Yeah, I
he
mean,
gave
I
a
think
timeline. I think he said that they all understand that those estimates need to happen ASAP.
Okay.
our experience though is people's understanding that something needs to happen and it actually happening are not always
Right.
aligned.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other questions for me? And again, I can share this with the board too, but it is up on the website.
This is great, Brittany. Thank you very much for putting this work in.
Welcome. Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
Yeah, it
I'm
looks
gonna
good.
unshare my, oh, sorry, Victoria, did you have?
No, I was just gonna thank you and see if Jory or Chip had any questions lingering.
I don't, oops, do you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yep.
okay, I didn't see, I've still got the slide up here, so I don't have anything. I thank Brittany for that. These are, obviously, there's so many assumptions we have to make that, you know, the actual dollar numbers are in a huge range, obviously, so
Yeah.
which is the way it has to be. It can't be any other way. But it does put it at least with a little perspective. As I've constantly said, that we have to know some of those numbers, because if we don't proceed ahead at some point over these next years or whatever with this kind of a direction, we're going to be gutting our schools in ways, because high school is going to be the one that gets gutted the worst because of the fact it's got the most faculty, and middle school in the same way. So it has to happen, and it's good to have at least something as starting with this. Now, the whole facilities component of it is important too, because people at times will ask me, well, why would it save any money, that much money, to close a school if they already pay very little for electricity because they've got a solar panel and
Yeah.
or something like that. So
Yeah, and one day, you know, we'll hand it over to David shortly, and if Jory has anything, but I did want to say that, you know, when I was looking at this, I was thinking back to when we first started this and some of the estimates that we put out. And this may feel shocking in comparison to that, because I don't think we were projecting this initially, and we didn't have it as developed a model. And, you know, actually looking at FTE, we're able to really reduce the range of costs that we're looking at. The other
Right.
thing about the retreat that we had with principals is that I feel like the model that we presented was one that people felt good about. And that, of course, we were looking at things with an eye of conservatism in terms of the fiscal reality, but that, you know, it's not a bare bones model, and it was one that they felt was equitable and, you know, ultimately provided, it was based on best practice. So that's all I'll say.
That's great to hear.
Yeah, and I just want to make an observation as we look at the savings, which are quite significant. Let's remember that we aren't sacrificing programming under this model. All of our elementary school students are still in this model going to have access to the same, the same specials as well. And Spanish isn't going away. We're not having to sacrifice from a curriculum perspective, which I think is really important. And then we also aren't seeing the outlandish bus rides that there's been a lot of concern around. And I'm just looking at class sizes too. And I think the cap of like around the 18 to 20 feels reasonable. So it's just, I'm expressing this as a positive that we are considering a model that brings real savings while preserving the things that matter to us.
I think it's worth noting too that the original, visioning and guiding principles really point more towards a two school model, and that the board and the facilities committee has really been, I think, responsive to, what are the needs of the community, what are the needs, what are the facilities that you have, and have adapted that model to sort of the facts on the ground. Because, if you were really to follow the wanting full-time staffing, you'd be in a two-school model, and I think, but that doesn't really address geographically the needs and some other needs in the district. So I think it's a good compromise.
Great.
David, do you want to take it from here in terms of?
Yeah, so I'm not exactly sure. There's a couple of things I wanted to point out. I have a couple of documents I could share, but when we did our report, we came up with a deferred maintenance number for all of the elementary schools, and that was in 2020 dollars, and that was 17,409,000. So, but if you're focusing on these three schools, it's 10.9 million. So right there's sort of a $6.5 million savings. If you assuming, let's say, by the time this all sugars out, we wouldn't do the work till 2023. I picked that number. The differential between what you'd have to spend on all the schools in 2023 and what you'd have to spend on the three schools is about 7.3 million. So, so that's, the facilities issues don't quite model the same way as the, as Brittany's model, because she's looking at cumulative savings. I didn't think it was fair to cost escalate the deferred maintenance for 10 years, because presumably you want to take care of it sooner rather than later, because that's what taking care of buildings is all about. So I picked 2023 as sort of a number, and that's just the deferred maintenance piece. So if you didn't add to the buildings at all, or to fully to be able to house all your programs adequately, you would save the 7.3 million. I did do maybe I'll share my screen now. Let me know if you can see it. Can you see a colorful spreadsheet?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so I'm not going to get into the weeds on this, but what we did was we looked at what do you have, if you look at Bridport, there's the first column is what's existing, and then in a no bond approach, how would you rearrange, like how would you kind of rearrange the spaces to meet the program? So Salisbury and Mary Hogan line up, they have enough classrooms and they line up pretty well in that regards. What's happened in Bridport is there's a lot of classroom spaces that, there's a classroom space being used for a faculty room, there, things like that. So I've rearranged some of the spaces, and you can see in a no bond approach, there's no conference room. If you look at line 2C here, there's no mail or copy room. There's an art room, but there's no music room. Maker space or special projects, foreign language. There's no spaces for those kinds of functions. There's no real lobby. The library is undersized. There's no book room, the multi-purpose. So like, yes, you can get, it has the capacity from a classroom standpoint, but from a support service and some of those other kinds of functions, it's not, it doesn't have those spaces that support that. So the third column here where it says bond is, here I populated this column with the correct square footages based on the model to say, okay, if we were going to modify Bridport to house all these functions in spaces, so like art gets an art room, music gets a music room, foreign language has its own classroom. What you do is you look down here and you can see that on line 6F, you need an addition of 13,810 square feet. And I did that same exercise for all 3 schools. So you can see there's a slightly smaller addition for Salisbury. It's 6,869, and an even smaller addition for Mary Hogan. And then what I did was I rolled that into a cost model here. So what you're looking at here is that option 1, deferred maintenance only, if you add soft costs to this, which I may have double counted, but relative to each other, you can see that the total cost, if you did this in 2023, would be 14.6. And then this one is with the additions. Now, one of the caveats here is, it's strictly like taking the numbers where it says 13,810, 6,889. Those are coming off my spreadsheet. I'm multiplying by $300 a square foot. I'm adding 10% for site work. So this is a very crude mechanical model. It doesn't take into account any renovations that you would do inside of the building to kind of reconfigure things. It's really strictly looking at deferred maintenance and additions. And that number is 25 million. So if you look at the comparison here, you're spending $11 million or so to make the buildings 21st century learning spaces, 11 million more than just doing the deferred maintenance. So that's kind of I hope that gives people a sense of what the parameters are regarding the facilities and costs, just in very round, big numbers. But, and like I said, it doesn't line up exactly with Brittany's model because, presumably you wouldn't wait 10 years to do this. These numbers would just get more and more and bigger and bigger. But this anticipates tackling them and, at least the deferred maintenance in 4 years.
David, this is Mary. Could you go back to that previous screen?
Sure.
Thanks. Is it, is it true that the other schools or the other sites that we have considered in the 3-school model, if you scroll down to the bottom for Bridport, those other schools, that number would be bigger. It would be bigger than 13810. Is that true?
It would be, it'd be it would be bigger for the schools that are smaller, for sure. If you look at Weybridge or Ripton, they only have 4 classrooms. So you'd be adding a whole bunch of classrooms that you don't have to add here. So for several of the schools, yes, it'd be quite a bit bigger. Yeah.
And what school, so there are schools then, I'm assuming, given what you've referenced, like Shoreham or somewhere else where that number would not be bigger?
Yeah, I can't speak to that specifically. Like I don't have I can't do a classroom count in my head, but yeah, some of them would be more similar in terms of their size to Bridport. And then of course the two I mentioned were the two smallest
Right.
schools. Cornwall is quite small too. So I think those three would be bigger additions to get it up to this size. And you know, Shoreham might be similar, but I think it's a little smaller, but I couldn't really speak to that accurately without looking back at it.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
And your one other comment on the next slide where you said you might have double counted someplace, what order of magnitude is that thought?
Well, I have to go look back at the report. They may have included the soft costs here, so it would be a 20% order of magnitude.
Okay.
But the point of it is, so you'd really look at this number here, 12,000,
Okay,
12 million versus 21 million.
gotcha.
And, you know, it's 9, 10 million.
Yep.
But it's still the same order of magnitude relative to each other. You know, and I think if you look at the cost of, like, let's say you know, projects of these size are bonded projects, and you do that with either a 20 or 30-year bond, let's say. But even if you took 20 years, right? So let's say you did either one. If you dialed Brittany's savings of, what is it, 31 million over 10 years out to the life of the bond, you know, the cost of facilities is minuscule compared to the savings from staffing and other operations. You know, I mean, it's not nothing, but it just starts to become a smaller number when you really look at that over the life of the bond.
So Peter B, and Brittany, from a financial operational perspective, how do you start thinking about this? You know, here we have this plan where we have a potential of $3.3 million of annual savings weighted against a reality of now what we have to do from a capital improvement perspective. How should we think about those finances, or how can our community think about those finances?
Well,
I think there
Go
are
ahead,
a few
Peter.
different approaches that we could take, and I think we realize right now would not be the time to try to tackle all of our deferred maintenance as we're waiting to see what the impact of the pandemic is on state revenue. I think part of the FMP, the Facilities Master Planning process, should include, given where we are now, some kind of plan to address deferred maintenance across the district, and pushing that out probably to another kind of study committee or a process, a shorter one than this one, to look at, you know, kind of almost like a pre-bond launch, to look at what the needs are and to move that forward, whether that's out 3 years or 5 years. I'm not sure, and David probably has much more insight into that than I do. I think the you know, because we don't know what the budget impact will be, nor do we know what's happening with the excess spending threshold, which I mentioned last night, we've kind of stopped talking about in the near term because we're in this pandemic and worried about the impacts there. But previous to that, we were looking at this coming fiscal year being a year where we started to have to figure out how we're going to stay below that threshold to avoid the double taxation. So that's just another factor for us in in looking at any kind of reduction in budget could be swallowed up by those two realities, the revenue impact from the pandemic, or any kind of pressure, whether it's the spending threshold or the legislature decides to use some other means, and they talked about it going into this fiscal year and weren't able to do anything. But any other clawbacks or caps or other measures to decrease local spending that we're working through. So to kind of put it in a concise sentence, we can't pay for this deferred maintenance out of our yearly budget. It's going to have to be, at least that's my sense, based on all the factors I see. Brittany, did you have something to
Yeah,
add?
I was just going to say that, you know, when we're looking at the deferred maintenance, whether or not the board chose to move forward with one of these models, the deferred maintenance is there. If we remain status quo, then the number is just higher. So it doesn't feel like a helpful statement, I guess, but I think it is worth noting that those costs loom regardless of what we do. And the more that we can, design a model that frees up other resources, it enables us to deal with those things more quickly and better.
And Peter and Brittany, during the principals retreat, did you guys, when you were talking about modeling, I know you were focusing mostly on staffing, but did you talk about any of the shortfalls of the buildings and sort of what sort of space constraints they see? I mean, Brittany presented, that all the students fit and that the principals seemed, pleased with the fact that we can keep our programming and all that sort of thing. I wondered if the discussion about, well, we would need to have an art room or any of that sort of thing came up, or if they felt, hung up on that.
I don't, that we covered that, probably more in depth for the previous facilities committee meeting, where we talked about what we heard from the three principals at the three, Mary Hogan, Bridport, and Salisbury, in terms of kind of how they would foresee welcoming 120 students. So I think, every school we have has different, and David's done a great job of highlighting this through the heat mapping and other data he's shared. One school might have more kind of like have a maker space. Another school might have a larger cafeteria. Every school is different. So I think that would be kind of one of the next phases of looking at the 3-school, 4-school model, would be thinking about, what opportunities were there, and I put out to people, and I don't know if this is wise at this time to commit any of the ed reserve, but we could look at using some of the ed reserve to add something. And I know how much construction costs, so it's very easy to spend a lot of money quickly when even adding a room or adding a wall, or things cost a lot more than you would think. But I do think that's something to be looking at, is helping to improve schools and start to take away at some of the deferred maintenance. But again, like I said, I think we're going to have to tackle that as a whole. And I think, I've seen other districts in the state go out and fix the security system, do a bond for that, or do a bond for smaller pieces. I think it would be better to go out with all the needs and address them when the economy and the situation is right.
I do think, though, for me, it's going to be important to get a clear articulation of, if we're going with this 3-school model, and here are the benefits with regards to increased opportunity for 0.5 art, 0.5 for that whole litany, how is that building going to support those resources, right? Like, and have an understanding of, great, in Bridport, how does that actually play out? That now they have access to additional experiences. How is the building going to support those experiences from the get-go? Or else
Right.
I feel like we're then not reaping the benefits then of this.
Right. I mean, I know that every principal, parent, administrator could find lots of ways to spend money in our schools on facilities and such. But I'm wondering, are they seeing anything that's sending up red flags that say, yeah, the model looks good on paper, but we couldn't possibly do it in this building because we don't have room for X, Y, or Z? Is there?
That's what I was saying we talked about before. I mean, that is the question we asked, because I think that came up when the board said, let's look at the 3-school model. So we did ask them, like, could you see this, like, live in this enrollment for a minute? Picture this enrollment, would this work, and how would it work? Yeah, I mean, thinking about, this is a staffing model too. This isn't, we didn't tell principals, here's the finalized model. And so I think that's another next step kind of thing, is to look at where you're housing people and the flow and all that.
Yep.
Along with that, like, understanding how urgent the bonds would be. I mean, within the existing buildings, we know we can fit the student enrollment that we have projected, but I think it'd be important for us, for the community, to understand how imminent would a bond be and how necessary.
Yeah, so, I mean, other than the roof at Shoreham, which was flagged as potential urgent problem, we didn't have any, there were no, emergent. Sometimes we do these reports and we come up with something, we say, you need to deal with this now. Like, this is not a wait for a bond vote kind of situation. And I think the Shoreham roof was the only piece that I recall that was in that category. I just want to say a couple of things. One is, the savings from the operations and staffing side, I mean, is an opportunity to reinvest that money back into programs. Obviously, you want to return some savings if you can and mitigate rising costs, but it's a chance to reinvest it back into the system, both facilities and programs, and it would actually, free up more resources to do that. And I think what we've been talking about for a while is sort of a phased, a phased approach. One is, make the move, get the kids in the school, and then, develop. And as you're using the schools, you can you learn about what you get a better understanding of what you really need once they're repopulated, and then go out for a bond. And it could be a combination of deferred maintenance and renovations and additions, to be determined. Ideally, what obviously, ideally you'd have it all done before the kids moved in. But we do projects on schools that are in operation all the time. I mean, that's the standard thing, is you're doing a phased project with construction in the summer and during the school year, and you're moving kids around and within the building, and it's just what you do, because so that is doable. But we've always talked about a phased, like, could you move the kids in first without a bond, and then, okay, now let's figure out what these schools need. And we have kind of, hopefully bookended that conversation with, we know the deferred maintenance, we have a sense of the size of the additions. I think the renovation piece is probably the squishiest part at this point, but we have a sense, I think, scale wise, of some of the costs.
David, I think the challenge with first part of your statement, though, is that these savings that we're realizing, we're also anticipating they're going to quickly dissipate when we receive the number that we have to cut from our budget.
Right.
So this
Right.
$3.3 million looks great on paper, but in a few months, it's going to be nothing.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that is a dilemma. And I would just go back to what Brittany said. It's like the deferred maintenance pieces, you know, it's just, that stuff doesn't go away. It just gets worse. And, you know, unfortunately what we've seen is, especially if you have roofs that you're not taking care of and they start to leak and then you get mold, you know, then you've got bigger concerns that multiply. So, you know, it's a difficult situation to be in for sure.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, piggyback on what Peter had said about how we had chatted with, well, it was more formal than a chat, I guess, with principals at Salisbury and Mary Hogan and Bridport. And none of them said that, you know, throw up the roadblocks. It's not possible for us to do this model. Like, there are things that we may have to be creative with and, you know, thinking about different ways to use our spaces, but there was, you know, nothing that was like, we can't possibly.
Yeah, I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but I mean, not for the first part, which is that teachers are incredibly resourceful and they make do with, they work in conditions that, you know, most professionals couldn't bear. And unfortunately, what we see in Vermont is that the bar, there's sort of a poverty of hope or imagination, and the bar is so low that sometimes we come into schools and we talk with the staff and even the administration about, you know, 21st century learning and about, you know, how can we make spaces that align with your pedagogy, and they say, you know, I really just need more outlets in my room, or if I could just have a sink, I would be fine. And so I totally would expect that if given this 3-school model and with the programs proposed and the spaces there, teachers would be like very can-do, administrators very can-do about it. Like, yeah, we got this, because that's the way they are. But, you know, I think sometimes they don't even feel that they're allowed to say, you know what, to deliver art in a really, you know, to really do it, we need an art room. So that's just my insight from working with many schools for many years.
I appreciate that. And, you know, you can't really argue with that. I think it's what the battle that we have is balancing the finances with the vision.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think this group is pretty capable of dreaming big, and then you know, the reality of the finances, you know, pares that down a little bit. So I think we're just in a state where we want to be careful, or in a place where we feel like we need to be careful with, you know, with what expectations we set.
Absolutely.
You know, and working within those realities, remembering that when we invest in facilities, that's also investing in students, you know, and we're sending them strong messaging in the facilities that we're providing for them day after day. Air quality of the facility itself, usability, you know, that sends messages too about what we value.
I agree. Does anybody else have any further questions for David or Brittany, Peter?
I appreciate your insight, David, just from the human interaction with teachers and school districts, because obviously we're always a little insular in our perspectives, but yet it sort of sounds that way in Vermont. I mean, I just have seen that over my years working in schools, working as board member. And, there's some things that just are never going to fly because of that kind of attitude. And it's not just the attitude of teachers, it's also the attitude of the public. Our model has always been this local model in the past. So that's a lot different than a lot of other school districts and a lot of other part of the country where the dictum comes down to build new high school in a district, and it has nothing to do with what the local population says. The data may, but not the population itself. So.
All right, so next steps. We talked about how one of the next steps is how the model actually fits into the spaces. So is that something, Peter, that how do you plan on moving forward, that sort of thing, or what?
Yeah, but I think there's a next iteration of this, working with Brittany and David to really look at the spaces, to review the heat map, to get some numbers, kind of probably the future beyond, maybe even beyond 10 years, and thinking about, some of what David was sharing regarding investment and, 20 to 30 years. There's probably also, I would think we would also want to be talking about what, there were questions today about a bond and when and how, and if, in looking at these models, what would anything be tied to the model related to bond, I think would be helpful to talk through, specifically as it relates to putting together the facilities master plan and the kind of the proactive planning document that the board and future boards will use to think about, facilities, what we have, where we need to invest. David, anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, I think one thing this committee could provide guidance with is the time horizon for, the planning horizon for this study. In other words, should we be looking at 10 years? Should we be looking at the life of the bond? In other words, because right now, like Brittany and we're on like different timelines, and I think it would be a more powerful or cohesive presentation if, let's say, we all decided 20 years, right? Because any investments in facilities, you could, because like when we talk about, let's say, investing 15 million, like the cost per year isn't obviously 15 million. You can model a bond payment over the life of the bond pretty easily. Well, Brittany can, I can't, but anyway, I think if we got our time horizons aligned, then you could say, look, over 20 years, like, this is the impact. And, if the board decides that they're just going to do deferred maintenance, or they're going to do deferred maintenance and, upgrade the buildings in different ways, you could talk about it over the same time horizon. So that would be helpful, I think.
We have always spoken in a 10-year horizon.
Okay.
But talk to Brittany and Peter. What are the pros and cons of 10 versus of planning 10 versus 20? What do people think?
I mean, I think there are certain things within the plan that I think are fine to plan out 10, 20, 30. I just think we selected a 10-year plan just to, to kind of put our arms around a time period we could fathom.
Mm-hmm.
Looking at the last 10 years, I'm not sure I can fathom the next 10, but
right.
So yeah,
borrow your crystal ball.
Yeah, I agree.
But I think
Yeah, I think as soon as we start getting to a 20-year plan, it becomes irrelevant almost.
Yeah, I think the difficulty with facilities is that I guess you could model the bond payments for the first 10 years if you were looking at it on an annualized basis, and then just the last 10 years of the bond are, for future committee to deal with,
They're
or
someone else's problem. They'll get paid
Yeah.
by someone.
So that would work for me. I just think it's be good to get aligned on that.
Just one other point and we haven't really talked about some of the questions that have come up in our process of proceeding have to do with economic equity or economic distribution or the equity of the schools. And, I just don't know where we sort of plug that into it's not a monetary, well, it could be, I suppose, with transportation and whatever, but at some point we need to figure out a way to do that. I mean, just the example somebody pointed up, and I don't remember who it was, that said if the Shoreham and Bridport kids were on the same school, we'd be having a very different school than the other school, the Salisbury School, potentially, as far as just the distribution of economic diversity and whatever. So it's so much more complicated, and I don't mean to throw a monkey wrench in it, but I'm just trying to get a sense of how we actually answer that question, at least in a preliminary way that isn't just sort of off the cuff, oh, we'll figure it out. I'm not sure. Maybe I'm just a little bit too trying to think of where it fits into all these other equations. Because that's one of our goals. The equity is not just in whether every kid has art. It's the balancing of these, quote, 3 schools, if that's the number, so that we have a general distribution of equity across the entire district.
Absolutely. And I think that I think that we are at the point in the modeling where we really need to start talking about how are we redrawing the lines and what is school choice going to mean? Because, we can get a transportation study done and that can give us general ideas, but if we're not talking about specific kids and specific families, the estimate that nobody's going to be in the bus for more than an hour is great as a starting point, but we don't know for certain that that's the reality until we know what the boundaries are and who's going to what school. So I think as we go forward and we look at, will the model fit in these schools, the question that has to be coupled with that is, and what kids are going where? Peter, do you think that's an appropriate next step, or do you think I'm getting ahead of them?
I don't think you're getting ahead at all. I think it's already in the model that the lines would be redrawn to balance the communities. And I know, a number of people have come forward throughout the last 3 years to talk about some of the challenges we face as a district. We've seen this throughout the years in the middle school and high school. We know that we have the greatest income disparity of any community in Vermont. That came out, there was data like 3 years ago or 2 years ago that I remember reading. And I wasn't surprised to see it at all. We have a lot of socioeconomic diversity, and if you look right now at our free and reduced lunch status across our towns, some of our towns have really low FRL and some have higher FRL. And so having, the 3-school model would enable us to balance what, Chip is talking about, which is the socioeconomic kind of mix of our community, as opposed to the stratification that has happened naturally through people purchasing real estate in different towns. And I mean, you can see that in the data.
Right, but we can say that, and I think what you've just said is absolutely consistent with what we've been saying all along. But I think, you know, as Barbara pointed out in her opening remarks, is that now we need to take the step beyond saying that we're going to create these communities and actually show how they're going to be created. So, you know, I think people are.
Well, I
ready.
mean, I would be hesitant in the next meeting, for example, to say, here are the boundaries, because people will quickly say, oh, so this is the boundary. I mean, these have pretty big implications for people. So
Yeah, no,
I
I'm not
think-
saying let's do the boundary,
Yeah,
but we need
yeah.
to show how we're going to select the boundaries and, you know, how we're going to look at school choice and its impact on where kids are going to go, and sort of start that. I'm not saying that we're going to complete it and know where every address belongs to what school. But I think we're ready to get that next.
What most districts across the country do with something like this is they're constantly looking at population density and making adjustments, and they do a review of those boundaries every X number of years. So
I lived
that's
in
probably something that, you know, as you're looking at, you know, a good question to have in looking at this model is, so what happens if there's a bubble in one community? How does that work? And so the two ways that districts address that are through reviewing the boundaries if there's a consistent growth pattern or decline in a certain area, and then the other is school choice, which is a way that districts balance the number of students in each school. And you know, the common way to approach that is through offering a certain number of slots based on capacity within a school.
And then it's a lottery from there. So if you have 10 spaces to fill, but you've got 30 families, you do it by lottery or something like that.
I don't know.
Peter's frozen.
Peter's frozen. You
Peter's
stumped
frozen.
him.
I'm assuming that's how
Right.
it's done in places that I've lived in the past. Is
Well, that's how high school choice works too. The lottery.
Victoria, I agree with your point, though. We have to at least be able to communicate the process that we're going to go through with regards to the identification of what these community schools will encompass. That can't be a, you know, 2 years, like, we just have to explain what that process, or figure out what the process is and then explain it.
I agree. And I think we're at that moment. We're ready to figure out what the, you know, how we would go about drawing the lines and so.
I'm also wondering, after looking at the 3 and the 4 school model, if the committee wants to provide any direction as it relates to that or not.
I mean, for me, I'd like to see, Peter said that the next step is to really show the articulation of how in these 3 schools, the plan gets played out, given the spaces that they currently have. Before I would be comfortable supporting a decision, I would want to see that first, I think.
Okay.
I don't know, Victoria, how do you feel about that? And Chip and Jory?
I agree. I think, you know, before making a decision like that, I'd like to hear about, you know, what it would look like on the street level.
Well, when we put when we went to the 3, basically, because it would accommodate the no bond, we also put in the idea of the 4 being not an unreasonable comparison, so to speak. So I don't want to see it go until we have looked at it a little bit further, although it would seem that the 3 school model is going to be the strongest model for a lot of reasons at some point.
unless I'm looking at the data, I mean, this is like quickly looking at a chart that Brittany has spent hours on, so I don't want to like not honor her work, but unless I'm missing something, it looked like the fundamental difference is a slightly smaller class size with the same resources applied and an increased cost of about $600,000 a year.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good distillation. I mean, so we built the model that way because the principals, after reviewing it, felt like it was really inequitable to have some schools with blended classrooms as a default or like as a mandate because space constraints. So once we decided that, it sort of lended itself toward building this type of model. It does create smaller class sizes. It is more expensive. You could model it with probably less FTE. But again, then we're getting into the same problems that we have now.
I guess I'm waiting for a really compelling argument about the 4-school model. You know, if we're talking about a difference in 2 students per grade between a 3 and a 4 school, considering, you know, David's perspective that really a 2-school model could accommodate our student enrollment, but the 3-school with 20 students per grade, what's the added value in the 4-school besides possibly lower transportation time for some students?
Right. I think the question initially was, you know, we knew we could fit the bodies into 3 schools, but can we fit the programming in? And I think we've gotten sort of part of the way there today in saying that it looks like we can fit programming, but I think from my point of view, we're not all the way there to convince me that 4 schools is off the table. You know, I would like to see more about what it would actually look like 3 versus 4 before making that. Is that sort of where you're getting at?
I mean, I kind of feel like, I mean, what 3 to 4 schools looks like, first of all, you have to pick the 4th school if you want to know what it looks like, right? Because we're talking about 2 different schools that at least currently, unless you're talking about adding on to the other 2. You know, I think in looking at what's the kind of the value add, I think there's probably a transportation improvement geographically, depending on what school you would choose. So I think that would be a benefit. You know, the total cost of 660 or whatever that was for staffing is doesn't include any of the facilities costs or any of the other operational costs. So I would expect that. I'm not sure how you would annualize that, but if we look at the cost of our individual school budgets before we unified, and I don't think it's a 1-to-1, but you know, we were around $1 million or a little over $1 million for most of our schools, like 900,000, 1.2, 1. This is just kind of off the top of my head. So you could be looking at, with the facilities cost of the 4th school and the operational costs. I don't know, David and Brittany, does that seem good?
Yeah, I mean, you would have to, the issue that you started to talk about, which is which is the 4th school. You have to pick one. You know, Ripton and Weybridge are don't really accommodate single age classrooms for K through 5, because I think they only have 4 classrooms, as I was saying earlier. So, and then you know, there's other issues with the other building. So you know, I know when we initially looked at that, there wasn't like a logical, like, of course, this is the 4th building. You know, it was you know, sort of a lesser of what you know, we didn't, and that's why I think there was a decision just to model it as just a 4th school, because because there really wasn't one that rose to the top as being like, oh, this is the logical one.
Right, I guess it's more, I want to see the data that a 3 schools wouldn't work. And then that would push
Right.
us to
Right.
pick a school and see what it would look like to have the 4th school. But
Right.
so far what I'm hearing is that 3 schools would work. I'd like to hear a little bit more about how
Right.
exactly it would work in the 3 schools before taking the 4th school, no matter what it is, off the table.
Right. Well, I think partially too, it's like, you know, it gets a little tricky because let's say if you take the 4th school and it has deferred maintenance of $1.5 million, you could be putting that money into one of the 3 schools to improve that building to meet the program needs in a 3 school model. So, but we could definitely, you know, I think that's all. I think we could model we could look at the 3 and the 4. Certainly you could do the cost modeling. Brittany's already done it, and we could do it from a facility standpoint as well. And I think then you know, it would just be an asterisk or a understanding, well, if we didn't have to put that money to the 4th building, we could be putting it into the 3rd building, one of the 3 buildings, to make it work better.
All right. So where
So
are
we
we?
know what we need to do.
I think I would, you know, I guess one question I have is is the next step to present back to the facilities committee or present to the board? You know, this next iteration, who would be the audience for that?
What does the committee think?
I think it's still a facilities committee at first, maybe not drawn out, but I
Mhm.
think, I just have a sense that would be better. Not in the long-term deal, but I think,
Yeah.
I guess that's my initial gut, but I don't know. You've presented a lot of different things, David. Do you have a gut?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we're at a critical stage where we really need to have our ducks in a row before going, you know, doing a public presentation or a board presentation. So I think there is maybe another iteration that we have to do before that happens. Because, you know, what happens with these studies is that you're looking at 30,000 feet and people ask you questions at 100 feet and you don't have the answers because you're not there yet. But you try to mitigate that as much as you can, you know, and try and at least have the big answers, the big questions answered. So I think it's worth having a pretty tight, well thought, well considered presentation. One area that I think needs, like we've got the facilities piece, I think, on the run here. We've got the staffing piece on the run. I think there needs to be an articulation in a written format of the sort of educational benefits. What are we gaining with this consolidation? What is the benefit of having a full-time librarian or half-time librarian or whatever, you know, this staffing change? And also, are there programs or co-curriculars that are going to be offered that just can't be offered now? And sort of articulating that in a I don't know if it's bullets, I don't know what format, but in a way that is part of that. Because we've always talked about the 3 legs of the stool. One is facilities, one is operations, and one is education. And I think being able to provide a positive vision of, look, it's win, 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 you know, on all three legs of the stool, would be a positive, you know, would be a good way to approach this.
Yeah, and I think, Victoria, I think part of what Amy was thinking the last e-chat would start to articulate, is correct?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think the Vicky Caitlin e-chat will sort of speak to the vision and the benefits of consolidation. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, and then but that's just, I think, one of a myriad of ways in which that articulation needs to happen.
I completely agree. And I think something we've heard again and again now is from the community of people saying, sell us on this, you know, tell us
Right.
why we should be excited about what this might provide for our kids. And, you know, with scale comes some real opportunities too. And I think, yeah, it'd be great to talk more about how we're going to leverage these resources, how we're going to distribute them more widely. And that's the part that, at least for me, is really exciting, you know, as an educator and as a parent. And those could be some very real advantages. So this is the time to add that in.
Yeah, because I mean, I think it is. There's, you know, there's educational opportunities, but those social opportunities too. There's, you know, opportunities for kids to have more. You know, when you're in a small school with small number of kids. I mean, I know we moved from East Montpelier to Shelburne, and it was just incredible in terms of the, you know, for our kids, just to be able to meet more kids and figure out who they were, find their tribe, all that. So I think there's that aspect as well. So yeah, talking about it from a positive standpoint, that this has so many positive attributes in all three categories. One of the things that we had proposed to Peter and Brittany was using the guiding principles, creating sort of a matrix where you have the guiding principles down the left-hand side, and then you look at the current situation with 7 schools, and you know, there's this discussion in each box about how does the current status quo live up to the guiding principles, and then this 3-school option, and use that as a way to perhaps structure a presentation about, like, how close are we getting to what you know, the board has aspired and articulated as worthwhile goals for the district.
I think one of the examples of some of the benefits that we found, you know, as Peter said, in building this model with the principles, it wasn't like pie in the sky, but it also wasn't bare bones. So some of the things that came out of that was, for example, a licensed social worker. Having a licensed social worker on staff in the buildings, they thought would be really helpful for social emotional learning. That's not something that we have now. Also interventionists. Some of the schools have interventionists, some don't, some are grant funded. So in this model, none of them are grant funded. I mean, that doesn't mean that is how it would be, but it wouldn't necessarily be reliant on that. So those were some of the conversations that we were having about, you know, ways to reallocate funds and realize savings.
Great. You know, I think our challenge going forward, and I think we're ready to address it, is really communicating, as we've all said, the benefits and what the vision of these models would look like in real life and how they would benefit students. All right, so does everybody feel comfortable with, I mean, I guess that meaning everybody, David, Brittany, and Peter, comfortable with sort of what's next?
Yeah, I think we've got a good handle on it and have lots to put together.
Okay. Mary, Chip, Jory, do you have any last questions, comments, or need for clarity?
No, I'm comfortable.
Just real quick, getting back to the boundaries question, would it be possible at the next meeting just to have a little more clarity about how that process works without getting into the nitty gritty, just in terms of, do we start with looking at population density and then take into consideration things like free and reduced lunch rates? Or it would be helpful just to visualize the order of that process or the different factors that are taken into account when we design boundaries.
Yeah, we have, I believe we shared it previously, a document that, or a spreadsheet that, no, it was a spreadsheet, it was like a map, I think, of that David shared, showing where students reside. So we can certainly talk from that. Again, I don't think we want to start drawing boundaries yet, but talking about the process we would use, yeah, for sure.
Just talking about how the population density factors in with other considerations. We know we're not going solely off of population here. Yeah, be interesting.
Yeah, I find that also important to know. And actually, this is fluid. I mean, one family that may change the statistics for one school versus another, and then that family's children go through schools and it's balanced off by another family in another school, which has none of those characteristics. So it's got to be a fluid, just like you said, Peter, you know, that districts do change this at times. And I don't know, I suppose in the days of busing to equalize racial differences in schools, they were constantly trying to figure this out in a much greater and bigger way. But this is sort of the same general issue as to how do we balance populations in the best way possible.
All right. So if there are no further questions, I think we can adjourn. Does that sound like a plan? All right, so adjourning at 1:48.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you, David.
everyone.
Thanks.
Peter, that